And I think what we're going to see here is that President Johnson, once he starts that term in 1964, is going to be able to go beyond his war on poverty, and he's going to have this long-term commitment to giving back to the community by starting something called the Great Society. And when we take a look at this, what we're going to see here is that, yes, President Kennedy, or President Johnson, does in fact help build consensus, but sometimes when we are able to do these programs that we have, like Vista, AmeriCorps, it can be hard to evaluate them, and we'll see President Johnson as he struggles to have this great society, this next step in American society. It's going to be hard for us to figure out which of these things is useful and which of these aren't. So here's what the Great Society is. The Great Society, once Johnson starts over and wins the election in 1964, is this idea where we should have an America that is, well, in his idea, in his terms, more perfect, more equitable, that the wealth should be attainable by all people, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender. So what you're going to see here is President Johnson turned to Congress and said, listen, we need several new programs, lots of programs, and I've only highlighted about 4 or 5 of them here for you in this video, because there's so many in the Great Society. But these programs are all designed to look at a group of people that are not treated well and find a way to treat them well. People that are oppressed, let's give them an advantage. People that are impoverished, let's make sure they've got a route to success economically, and so on down the line. So, one of the things that I know we've seen both FDR and even Teddy Roosevelt before that, Truman, right, and even Eisenhower a little bit, and Kennedy himself, one of the things that they all wanted was health care for the elderly, health care for the impoverished. Now, Johnson knew that he couldn't get national health care because Southern Democrats wouldn't vote for national health care. It would help too many African Americans. So what he does do, though, is he gets 2 separate programs through Congress, all designed for health care. One of them is Medicare, which is health care for the elderly, senior citizens. The other is Medicaid, which is health care for the poor. Both of those have survived to the present. Both of those have been expanded so they cover far more citizens and many, many, many more different ways in which you can receive benefits for your health care. But the point I'm making here is that Johnson sees a problem in our society where it's not equitable, something that many a president had tried to solve. But he, as a consensus builder, is able to get the votes needed to pass health care. What about this issue of poverty? How can we help people who are disadvantaged in terms of literacy, in terms of poverty, in terms of education? President Johnson says we should have something else that's also still around. Project Head Start. This goal here is to take preschoolers and help them catch up with those who are privileged. Remember when we looked at poverty a couple of chapters ago, a couple of lessons ago, and we said that students who come into kindergarten from the impoverished classes know or understand about 5,000 different words, whereas if you come from a privileged class, you know about 15,000 words. Project Head Start goes to shrink that gap down so that everybody has it closer to the same starting point. It's a success. The way it works now is that kids who are in Project Head Start can close that gap versus kids who aren't in it when it comes to kindergarten. So that is going to be a success. Other things that he starts here deal with cities. Remember, we talked a lot in chapter 14 about how cities were decaying, how they were collapsing as suburbs grew. The impoverished were left behind in those urban areas in the center of cities. Well, in low tax bases, you can't get those services that you need. Johnson's going to say, we can't let our cities fall apart like this. We need a Department of Housing and Urban Development, and this department's goal is going to improve transportation, healthcare, housing, and policing inside cities that are seeing this kind of collapse go on. Also, it's still around today. Other things that we'll see here, and this is a huge one, we're going to see Johnson say, you know what, it's not just a matter of us looking at the Great Society, and this is actually a comic book from the 60s saying the Great Society, where we need to target things like racism, like, that we need a majority of people on our sides in order to get these things passed. It's not just that kind of a thing. It's not going to be just tackling issues of poverty and race. What we also need to do is take a look at nativism. Now, we know since the 1920s we had a quota system based on ethnicity. National Origins Act, Emergency Quota Act. Johnson is going to have the Immigration Act of 1965, and it is an important bill because it destroys that nativist quota system. Now the quota system is based on job skills that are useful and reuniting family. Those are the two things that we focus on now in our job skills. And it's going to allow immigration from all over the globe, Asia, Africa, Europe, regardless of your ethnicity. This is huge, 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 huge. Take a look at immigration on this chart, right? You can see it so clearly. Right here's 1920 when we saw nativism, Emergency Quota Act, National Origins Act. Look what happens to immigration. Plop, all the way down to 1970. But right here, right before this, 1965, National Origins Act, Emergency Quota Act are out the door with Johnson's immigration bill. And look what happens to immigration. From all over the globe, it starts tracking up, 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 up again. It's radically changing the demographics of our country in a way that is much more equitable than it used to be under the quota system. Some other things that we're going to see here, and we're going to talk more about these in the next chapter, are going to include Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. These are landmark bills which are going to change the front of civil rights forever in America. We're going to have a whole chapter on that in chapter 16. But I think in closing, what I want to do here is just point out this last little bullet, which is that it's hard to evaluate these programs because there is no question that some of them are incredibly successful. But at the same token, or in the same token, it's been hard to make progress since, for a lot of different reasons. And we're going to look at that as we go through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s as class comes to an end. What is important to note is that right here, when Johnson makes his official war on poverty start, and then his Great Society, between here and here is the largest decline in the poverty percent, the poverty rate, the percentage of people in poverty that our country ever saw. So Johnson's consensus building from here to here, that consensus building led to, and these programs, War on Poverty, Great Society, led to the largest drop in the poverty rate in a short time span that our country has ever seen. That's a really big deal, and that's across all races. But you'll note what happens here. It flattens out, right? And it just kind of stays static. Doesn't really go anywhere for the remaining decades since that point in time. So we're going to take a look at that, because clearly some of these things must have been successful, but they must not have necessarily been all the way successful. So they are hard to evaluate. They do grow fast, these programs, but they are certainly well received. If you asked anyone about these programs I've mentioned here, no one would want to see them cut in the present day. And so we'll do more work with this in class tomorrow.